All right, what up, Dr. Lee? This is Scott again. Um, Funny thing, I lost my voice, so I hope this is okay. And this is my audience to prove that they're real people. That's them. Hi, hi. There's a little baby around here somewhere. Or maybe he dipped out. I don't know. All right, so hopefully you can see me. All right, so today's text comes from Micah 6 1 through 8. Hear what the Lord says. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember what Balak king of Moab devised, and what Balaam the son of Beor answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Word of the Lord. All right. So before we dive into the text, a little bit of context might be helpful. You need to know a little bit about Micah and who he's writing to. So Micah was a prophet. He spoke to a particular people, Israel, uh, on behalf of God. And during this time period, Israel was divided into two city states, essentially the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And during this time, Assyria had conquered them, and there was a bunch of upheaval and power struggles going to and fro. And through this time, what happened was that the people of Israel, they were given a certain amount of power by the Assyrians, and they actually started to oppress the poor people in their land. So the Israelites actually started to oppress themselves, which is kind of counter intuitive, especially if you know their history. So Micah, he was a rural farmer, and he had this nasty habit of walking around naked while he prophesied. Apparently, it was because he was spiritually humble, but who could say? And so he did that, and earlier in the book, he actually refers to the oppressed as his people. So a lot of scholars think that he was actually an oppressed farmer, and he was actually bringing this indictment against the Israel elite. Now, Assyria took over, but there were like a lot of bad things happening with the kings here. Anyway, Micah actually prophesied through the reigns of three kings: Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Jotham, he sucked. He was the one that was like, "Hey, you know what? I'm gonna say we follow this God, Yahweh, but all the pagan high places where they worshipped pagan gods and idols and stuff, we're just going to keep them up there." So he let that corruption stay in Israel. Then there was Ahaz, who went on the bandwagon a little bit more, and he was like, "Hey, here's a good idea. I'm going to reject Yahweh so much that I'm actually going to burn my son as a sacrifice for this god named Moloch." That'll come later, unfortunately. And then there was Hezekiah, and Hezekiah was actually a pretty good guy, all things considered. And what he did was he actually tried to reform Israel. And the reason what a lot of scholars think is that he did that because of Micah's direct preaching to his kingship. So there's a lot going on in this passage, I know. And so we're going to try to dissect a little bit. The first part of this passage actually starts with language that sounds a lot like a courtroom. And that's because that's essentially what it is. What Micah is writing here is referred to as a covenantal lawsuit. So there are two people in a covenant, and then one of them breaks the terms for that covenant. And so the the people who broke this covenant are the Israelites, and so God is essentially suing them for defamation of character because they're blaming the covenant breaking on him. Because in Exodus 6:7, which is one of the about 5 covenants in the Old Testament, uh, it's when God first speaks to Moses, and he's like, "No, I'm gonna do this awesome thing. I'm gonna bring your people out of Egypt, and then this awesome thing's gonna happen. We're gonna have this relationship forever, and you will be my people, and I will be your God." And that's like a recurring theme throughout uh, this the history of the Israelites. Now the thing is all like Yahweh is saying that he will take care of them, he will provide for them, and all that the Israelites have to do is obey him. That's it. That's all they have to do. And they just keep doing like breaking that over and over and over again. So, like I said before, it's essentially a defamation of character because in verse 3 of Micah 6, it says, "Oh, my people, what have I done to you? How have I wearied you? Answer me." So he's already answering a question with a question, like, how have I wearied you? So it's been given that the question has been asked. And so with the idea of weariness, it's not like a physical thing, but it is kind of like a burden. It's more of a spiritual nuance. Like, you have burdened us so much spiritually with all the things that you want us to do that we're going to reject you because you have not taken care of us. And he's like, what? Um, and so that's just ludicrous. And that kind of brings us to where the mountains are. This is when in the first in the second verse it says, "Hear you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel." And this is like God first saying how he's going to prove his faithfulness to um, the Israelites, is that even in pagan cultures in the ancient Near East where this took place, parties that were making a covenant with each other would call upon celestial bodies or huge structures like of nature, like mountains or valleys or whatever, to be a witness to that covenant besides regular people, because those things never ended. They were always there. So he's essentially saying, I'm going to say what they've done wrong to these mountains, and they will know that what I'm saying is the truth because they've been here for the test of time. And they were here before the covenant started, and they will be here long after everybody here is dead. So they have that testimony of history. It's a metaphor, but since they were involved with pagan practices, they kind of got the picture. So God is challenging Israel, saying, if I have failed you, then prove it. And of course, God can't prove it. Or of course, Israel can't prove it. So God goes on to share examples of how he has held up his end of the bargain. And so Yahweh in verses 3-5 bring up 3 specific examples. Brings up the Exodus out of Egypt. He brings up this episode of Balak and Balaam. And Balak was a king who hired a non-Israelite diviner to curse the Israelites. But then God flipped it around and used it to bless the Israelites. And then he also talks about these 2 places called Shittim and Gilgal. And essentially, they were on either side of the Jordan River. And Shittim was the first place or the last place that the Israelites camped before crossing the Jordan into the promised land, and then Gilgal was the first place that they camped after they had done the crossing. So at the end of verse 5, it says that you may know the righteous acts of God. And these are the righteous acts of God that we're talking about. And a better translation in other versions of the Bible is the saving acts of God. He's doing all these things to save Israel, to preserve his people. So he's like, you think that I have broken the covenant? I have done everything in my power to sustain this covenant. So how dare you, essentially. So in verses 6-7, it seems Israel is responding to the charges God has levied against them. It's a weird break because it all of a sudden sounds like somebody else is talking. Have you ever gotten into an argument in your head with your friend that's not there? Is like, they say this, and I'm going to say this, and then they're going to say this, and I'm going to say this. That's essentially what Micah is doing right here. He's saying that God has laid out his case, and so this is what the obvious response of the Israelites would be from verses 6-7. And so they start off pretty small with ways to repair this covenant relationship, and then they get really drastic really quick. First, they start out with like, hey, would a sacrificial calf be a good way to go? They're like, no, that probably wouldn't work. He's like, but wait, would like thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil be enough? Because like in the sacrificial system, rams and oil were both used for sacrifice. And in Hebrew literature, speaking of thousands and then tens of thousands of something is kind of like saying it's a number that cannot be imagined. So they're like, we're going to give you all the worship we can that you would not even be able to grasp how much it is. Would that be okay? They're like, well, maybe not. So then they do something absolutely stupid, and they just do the thing that God detests most. And he's like, and they go back to King Ahaz, and they're like, what if we sacrifice our firstborn sons to repair this relationship that we've broken with you? We want to do the thing that you detest the most. They're not really thinking clearly. And so in Leviticus 18:21, it actually says that God hates this so much, and it profanes his name. And so there's no way that God would accept that. So the problem with all these ideas is that there's nothing would change anything. There's no heart change. There's no mention of repentance at all or suggested by Micah portraying the Israelites' response. It's just like all these things would just be like a Band-Aid that's not a cancer that's just like spreading through the Israelite people. And what needs to happen is to return to the place of their first love, which is Yahweh. And the people said that God had wearied them while they were forgetting about his faithfulness to them. And it's hard because this passage seems very harsh. It sounds like God's just mad. And like he's just like, look at what I've done for you. And the Israelites are like, you abandoned us. And like, there's no way you can get back in my right relationship with me. You're not my people anymore. That's what it sounds like. But there is something missed upon the initial reading of this text. Well, at least for me. There's other people that are more observant. But throughout this whole thing, despite all the sin, despite all the abandonment, despite all the spiritual adultery that's going on, God always refers to the Israelites as his people. Still. And he's not saying in these texts, oh, my people, out of a sense of exasperation. He's saying, oh, my people, with compassion and mercy and love. And he's not pointing these things out to rub it in their faces. He's pointing them out to show his faithfulness. He's calling on the mountains so that they can eternally testify to his love for them. So what it goes down to say is that after all this is said and done, what is the most important? And he says to do justice, to love kindness and walk humbly with your God. And this essentially is an echo in the past of what Christ says in the future in Matthew, where he's like, love God, love others. That's it. That's all you got to do. And you will be in my heart. You will be following my heart. And so there's a lot to be said about what justice is and what kindness is and what does walking humbly with God mean. I just want to leave you guys with a couple questions, and maybe you guys can sit on it for a little while. Not right now. We have places to be. But when we think about our own relationship with God, do we find that we have perfected these three ideas? Maybe we get close with a couple. I know I struggle with each one of them in a different way throughout my life. Do we seek justice by trying to help the oppressed that are surrounding us every day with the systems that are put in place in our country, or do we just walk on by? Do we love kindness? Like, I kind of loathe kindness because I'm a selfish person, so that's one I always have to work on. And do we walk humbly with God? Do we really wrestle with the fact, like, once we get saved, do we just go back to everything we did in our former lives? Or do we try to honor that that relationship that we have with him? Like, how often do we actually think about Christ's death on the cross? And how does that affect our lives? And does that humble us? Does that give us a sense of like, wow? I don't really know else to say than that. So this whole sermon was not meant to be like a guilt trip. I don't think Micah 6:1-8 is supposed to be a guilt trip either. I think it is a call. It is a reaching out. It is God reaching out to us to return to our first love, which is him. Let us be his people as he has always been our God. Done. Bye, Dr. Lee. There's a little